Some knocks asked to be answered, but that night the door carried away of a life with no voice left to cry for help. Night had settled gently over the rural clinic, the kind of quiet that usually brought relief after a long day. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and dry grass, and the only sound was a low hum of a ceiling fan stirring the heat. Dr. Allen stood at the stainless steel table, rinsing his hands after finishing paperwork, when the stillness broke. It wasn't a knock. It was a deep, jarring thud that rattled the wooden door and echoed through the narrow hallway. The vibration traveled through the floor and into his chest, heavy and raw, as if something enormous had leaned its full weight against the building. He froze, listening. His mind reached first for ordinary explanations, a vehicle, perhaps, or fallen equipment, but none of them fit the slow, deliberate rhythm of the sound. Another impact followed, lower this time, accompanied by a scraping noise along the wall. Whatever was outside was struggling to remain upright. Allen felt a tightening in his stomach, a sense of urgency that arrived before reason. He moved toward the door without thinking to arm himself, instinctively reaching instead for his medical bag. Years of practice had taught him to recognize distress long before he could name its source. When he opened the door just enough to peer outside, the light spilled onto a massive shape, swaying in the darkness. A lioness stood there, her coat dulled with dust, her sides heaving as she fought for breath. She did not bare her teeth or roar. Her amber eyes were unfocused, clouded with pain, yet fixed on him with something close to pleading. Only then did Allen notice the blood matted into her fur and the unnatural angle of her leg, the metallic glint of a rusted snare cut cruelly into flesh already swollen with infection. But it was her belly that truly stopped him. It hung heavy and low, taut with life waiting to emerge. She was heavily pregnant, her body strained beyond its limits, her strength nearly spent. This was no accidental encounter. Somehow, through instinct or memory or sheer desperation, she had dragged herself across miles of unforgiving terrain to the one place that smelled of medicine and safety. As if surrendering to the effort, her legs buckled. She collapsed onto concrete with a hollow sound that carried the weight of exhaustion and trust combined. Allen stood motionless for a moment, aware of the danger pressing in from every direction. A wounded lioness was unpredictable. A lioness in labor was even more so. Every rule he had ever learned warned him to keep his distance, to protect himself first. Yet the animal before him did not move to strike. She lay there breathing hard, her eyes never leaving his face, as though waiting to see what choice he would make. The clinic doorway suddenly felt like a line drawn between two worlds. Behind him were tools, light, and human order. In front of him was raw instinct, pain, and the fragile beginning of new life. Allen could feel the weight of that boundary settling onto his shoulders. He called softly for his assistance, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, and knelt just far enough away to let the lioness know he was not leaving. The smell of blood and earth filled the air, grounding him in the reality of the moment. As the night deepened around them, the decision became clear without words. This place, small and unassuming, would have to become a refuge. The clinic would no longer be just a building. For this one night, it would stand as a fragile meeting point where fear met compassion, and where a wild mother placed her last hope in human hands. Allen moved slowly, aware that every shift of his body could be read as a threat. The lioness lay on her side, her breathing uneven, the rise and fall of her ribs shallow and strained. Up close, the damage to her leg was worse than he had feared. The flesh around the snare was swollen and dark, the smell of infection sharp in the warm night air. Flies hovered, drawn to blood and heat, and he brushed them away with careful motions that would not startle her. She watched him continuously, her eyes alert despite exhaustion, tracking his hands, his posture, his intent. He spoke quietly as he worked, not because he believed she understood the words,
"You're right,"
but because the rhythm of his voice seemed to steady them
My
both.
name is Allen.
He explained each movement aloud,
I'm here to
grounding
help.
himself in routine. A mild sedative was
Nobody
prepared,
else is coming.
measured far lower than usual, and administered with precision. Stronger medication could endanger the unborn cubs, and Allen could not take that risk. The lioness flinched at the initial sting, a low sound rumbling deep in her chest, vibrating to the concrete beneath his knees. He paused, meeting her gaze, waiting until her muscles softened again before continuing. Removing the snare required patience and strength in equal measure. The wire had bitten deep, and freeing it meant working close to bone. Sweat gathered along Alan's temples as he applied steady pressure. His hands slicked despite his grip. The sound of metal giving way was abrupt and loud in the stillness. But the lioness did not lash out. She drew a sharp breath, then released it slowly, her head settling back as if a constant, blinding ache had finally loosened its hold. The absence of pain seemed to drain what little strength she had left. Almost immediately, her body tensed again. A contraction rippled across her abdomen, unmistakable and powerful. Alan recognized the shift at once. Labor had begun in earnest, and the lioness was dangerously weak. She strained briefly, then stilled, her sides trembling. Another contraction followed, less effective than the first. The effort of reaching the clinic had cost her dearly. Survival was no longer the only concern. New life was pressing forward, and she might not have the strength to bring it into the world alone. Alan placed his hands gently against her belly, feeling the muscles tighten and release beneath his palms. It was an intimate, unthinkable act, one that defied everything he knew about wild animals. Yet she did not recoil. Instead, she leaned subtly into the contact, her breathing sinking with a steady presence. Instinct urged her to protect herself, to guard her vulnerability. But exhaustion tempered that instinct. Trust, fragile and unspoken, filled the space between them. When the first cub began to emerge, the process was slow and uneven. Alan worked carefully, guiding when necessary, retreating when her body took over. The lioness groaned softly, a sound of effort rather than aggression, her tail flicking against the ground. Time seemed to stretch, measured only by breath and motion. At last, the cub slipped free, small and slick, its body startlingly still. Alan reacted without hesitation. He cleared the tiny airway, rubbing firmly, coaxing breath into fragile lungs. The lioness lifted her head, eyes wide, watching every movement with aching focus. When the cub finally gasped and cried, the sound cut cleanly through the tension. The lioness reached forward, licking the newborn with urgency and care, her purr beginning low and uncertain. 2 more cubs followed, each arrival demanding patience and resolve. Through it all, the lioness endured, never once turning her strength against the man beside her. By the time the final cub lay nursing, the night felt different, heavier with meaning. What had begun as a desperate collision had become something quieter and deeper. In shared stillness and restraint, a bond had formed, not through dominance or fear, but through calm, deliberate care. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through pale light and dust motes drifting in the clinic air. The cubs slept pressed against their mother's belly, small bodies rising and falling in uneven rhythm. The lioness lay still but alert, her eyes opening whenever footsteps sounded nearby. Alan moved softly as he checked the bandage on her leg, adjusting it with practiced care. She did not bare her teeth. She watched him, calm but vigilant, acknowledging his presence with a slow blink that felt less like tolerance and more like recognition. Time softened the edges of fear. Fluids ran steadily, and the harsh smell of infection slowly faded beneath antiseptic and clean cloth. When Sarah or Mark approached, the lioness shifted, her paw drawing closer to the cubs in quiet warning. But when Alan stepped near, her muscles loosened. She allowed him to examine the wound, to listen to her breathing, to weigh the cubs briefly in his hands. Each small permission felt earned, not given freely, and Alan accepted it without pride. By the 3rd day, strength had returned to her frame. She stood without swaying, her gaze sharper, her movements measured. Outside, birds called from the acacia trees, and a distant wind carried the scent of open land. The cubs explored clumsily, tumbling over each other, unaware of how close loss had come. Watching them stirred something heavy and gentle in Alan. He understood then that care was never about possession. It was about preparing for departure. When the transport gate was opened, no urgency followed. The lioness stepped forward slowly, testing the ground, then paused as if to measure the moment. Alan stood back, offering space instead of guidance. There were no ropes, no commands, no show of dominance. just open land ahead and quiet understanding behind. She turned once.
Days later, the lioness
her expression neither tame nor wild.
With cubs
it carried memory.
Exploring.
It carried choice. Then she moved on, the cubs weaving around her legs. They walked together only a short distance, but it felt longer, stretched by meaning. The lioness's stride regained its confidence with each step, the rhythm of the wild returning to her body. Alan stopped at the edge of the trees, where grass thickened and shade deepened. This was not a farewell shaped by emotion or ownership. It was a recognition of shared survival. She paused, lifted her head, and released a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the still air. Neither threat nor affection. She turned without hesitation and disappeared into the brush. The cubs following until the grass closed behind them. Silence returned, layered and complete. Alan remained where he was, feeling the echo of that moment settle inside him. What passed between them required no explanation, no retelling shaped by spectacle. It existed simply as proof that compassion could cross even the oldest boundaries. As he walked back toward the clinic, the morning light seemed warmer, the land unchanged yet newly understood. The door stood open behind him, ordinary once more, but the threshold it represented would never feel the same again. He carried no sense of triumph, only humility and gratitude. Somewhere beyond the trees, a mother raised her young, untouched by human claim, and within him, a quiet certainty remained that kindness given without demand could ripple outward, unseen yet enduring. The experience settled into memory like a scar that did not ache, a reminder rather than a wound. It would shape how he listened, how he chose patience over fear. That he knew was enough. For both worlds, for one morning, and perhaps many quiet nights to come afterward.